The conference room on Deck 7 smelled like recycled air and old arguments. That was normal. What was not normal was the silence that had followed Dr. Sevrikan's last sentence, a silence so complete that Mara Akafer could hear the faint hum of the ventilation cyclers 3 bulkheads away. Sevrikan was the oldest xenobiologist in the consortium fleet, 140 standard years, body like a folded piece of parchment, eyes the color of shallow coastal water. He had spent the last 12 minutes laying out 5 millennia of Vethani scientific failure on a holographic display, and now he was looking at the rest of the room with an expression that translated, roughly, as, "There it is. There is the proof of our collective inadequacy." Mara was 17. She was the youngest person in the room by approximately 120 years, and she had been invited purely as an administrative error. Someone in records had confused her father's senior research clearance with her own trainee badge. By the time the mistake was caught, the briefing had started, and consortium protocol held that interrupting a classified session for any reason short of hull breach was a court-martial offense. So Mara sat at the far end of the table, next to the water dispenser, with her tablet in her lap, and the quiet, practiced expression she had learned from watching her father navigate rooms where he was the only human. "The Cathara equation," Sevrikan said, gesturing to the display, "remains unsolved. It has been unsolved for 5,211 years. Every Vethani mathematician who has approached it has either failed or, in 11 documented cases, experienced complete cognitive collapse attempting to hold its recursive structures in working memory simultaneously." He paused. "We do not speak of those 11. The display showed a spiraling structure, not quite a fractal, not quite a lattice, something between the two. Mara had seen fractals. She had seen lattice mathematics in her second-year physics module. What the Cathara structure did, as far as she could tell from a 30-second glance, was both at the same time, in alternating temporal layers. Each layer contained the solution to the previous one while simultaneously depending on the solution of the next. It was, in the most basic sense, a loop with no beginning. She looked at it longer than she should have. "The equation," Sevrikan continued, "is not merely theoretical. It is the lock on the Hekaru vault, the sealed chamber at the heart of this station. The vault contains what we believe to be a dormant entity of pre-consortium origin, entombed here for exactly 4,000 years by the founding architects. The architects believed the entity was dangerous. They built the Cathara lock specifically because they believed nothing that came after them would be able to open it. They were, until now, entirely correct." "Until now," said Commander Vrek, who was in charge of station security and had the compressed look of someone who had not slept in several days. "Because the vault is beginning to open itself." No one spoke. "The lock is degrading from within," Sevrikan said. "Something inside the vault is applying pressure to the Cathara structure from the other side. We estimate 12 to 16 hours before the outer containment fails entirely." Mara looked at the equation on the display. Then she looked at her tablet. Then she looked at the equation again. She had a habit, her father called it an embarrassing habit, her teachers called it disruptive, of writing things sideways. Not literally sideways, but of approaching problems from the direction no one was facing. She had gotten a perfect score on her xenomathematics module, not because she had memorized the consortium's approach to recursive structures, but because she had found a different approach entirely, one that her instructor had described as technically correct in a way that should not be possible given the student's age and preparation. The equation on the display was a loop with no beginning. That was the problem everyone was trying to solve: find the beginning of the loop. Mara's thought, which arrived with the quiet immediacy of something obvious, was, "What if you don't?" She typed something on her tablet, then she erased it, then she typed it again longer. At the far end of the table, a Vethani xenomathematician named Kale Sorrow was presenting the consortium's 47th approach to the problem. He had a colleague who was going to present the 48th. There was, apparently, a list. Mara raised her hand. No one noticed. She raised it higher. The water dispenser gurgled. "Excuse me," she said. Sevri Khan looked at her. The rest of the room looked at her. Commander Vrek looked at her with the expression of someone who had just remembered there was a human teenager at the end of the table. "You're the HFY trainee," Sevri Khan said. "Yes. Your clearance for this briefing is." "An administrative error, yes, I know, I'm sorry." She held up her tablet. "But I think the equation is," she paused, tried to find the right word, settled on the honest one, solved. The silence that followed was different from the first silence. The first silence had been the silence of collective failure. This one was the silence of collective disbelief, which is a much more hostile kind. Kale Sorrow, who had been mid-sentence when she interrupted, said something in Vethani that the translator rendered as, "The trainee appears to have spoken." "I did," Mara said. She walked the tablet down the table to Sevri Khan. He looked at it. He looked at her. He looked back at it. "This is," he started. "It's an entanglement pivot," Mara said. "The equation looks like a loop with no beginning because everyone's been treating it as a sequence. But it's not a sequence. It's a state. You don't solve it by finding the start point, you collapse the superposition by observing the whole structure simultaneously as a single condition. It's like," she hesitated, "it's like asking which came first, the chicken or the egg, and the answer is that the question is wrong. Both came first. Neither came first. The moment you observe them as simultaneous, the loop resolves." She paused. "I wrote the collapse function on page 2. Sevri Khan turned to page 2. The room was very quiet. He turned to the Zeno-mathematician next to him and showed him the tablet without speaking. The Zeno-mathematician looked at it for a long time. He picked up his own stylus and checked something on his personal pad. He put the stylus down. "This is correct," the Zeno-mathematician said. Kale Sorrow leaned over. "Read it." Set his pad down carefully, like someone putting down something heavy. "This is correct," he said. Sevri Khan looked at Mara. He had the expression of someone trying to decide which of several large feelings to have first. "You are 17 years old," he said. 17 and 4 months, Mara said. "It took our greatest mathematicians 5,000 years. "Your greatest mathematicians," Mara said carefully, "were all trying to find the beginning of the loop. I don't think there is one. I think that was the point. I think whoever built the lock was counting on you to keep looking for a beginning." She paused. "My dad always says the hardest part about a locked door is remembering that the door is the answer, not the lock." No one said anything for a moment. "Your father," Sevri Khan said, "is Dr. Emeka Akefur." "Yes." "The xenoarchaeologist." "Yes." "He's currently in the vault access corridor," Commander Vrek said, looking at her calm display with an expression that had shifted from disbelief to something considerably more urgent. "He was part of the initial response team. He's been trying to reach us for," she checked, 42 minutes. The containment alarm went off 11 seconds later. The vault access corridor was a long throat of polished black stone, original founding architect construction, 4,000 years old and looking every minute of it. The lights along the walls were amber, the station's equivalent of a held breath. Mara followed Commander Vrek and Sevri Khan through 2 security checkpoints, both of which took longer than they should have because no one had thought to update her clearance in the 7 minutes since the mathematics situation. Her father was standing outside the 3rd checkpoint with his arms crossed, and the look he got when he had been waiting for something to happen, and it was taking longer than his patience could accommodate. He was a tall man, deeply dark-skinned, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead that he never actually used for reading. He saw Mara and his expression did several things in rapid sequence. "Why?" he said. "Administrative error," she said. Why are you in the security corridor? They needed the equation. He looked at Vrek. Vrek said she solved the Kethara lock. Emeka Akafor looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he said, "Of course she did," in the tone that was somehow simultaneously proud and completely exhausted. "The lock is solved," Commander Vrek said, "but the vault is still opening. Whatever is inside has been pushing against the structure from within, and the pressure hasn't stopped." "It won't stop," Emeka said. "I've been trying to tell you for 40 minutes. The entity inside isn't trying to escape. It's trying to communicate." He pulled up a scan on his own pad, a waveform, complex and looping, with a rhythm to it that Mara recognized even before her father pointed it out. "That's the same structure," she said. "Same structure," her father confirmed. "The entity has been pushing the Kethara waveform back through the lock for as far as I can reconstruct, approximately the last 300 years. It's been broadcasting the equation, not the lock, the answer. It's been sending the collapse function outward over and over for 300 years, and nobody outside could read it because nobody outside had the mathematical framework to recognize what they were receiving." He looked at Vrek. "It wasn't trying to break out, it was knocking." The corridor lights shifted. Amber became something cooler, a pale blue that had no direct analog in the station's standard alert palette, which meant it was coming from somewhere else entirely. From the other side of the vault door. The door itself was founding architect construction, a single seamless disc of black composite, 3 meters across, without visible hinges or seams. It had not moved in 4,000 years. It moved now, not dramatically, not with grinding force, but with the steady, deliberate patience of something that had been waiting a very long time and was prepared to be careful about what happened next. It slid sideways into the wall. The light inside was the same pale blue, warm somehow despite the color. And in the center of it, standing, because it was awake, because whatever had been dormant had woken up sometime in the last 3 centuries and spent that time learning to knock, was something that had no obvious category in the consortium's taxonomy of known species. It was tall, not imposingly tall, thoughtfully tall, the way old trees were tall, as though height had simply accumulated over time. Its surface was not exactly skin and not exactly shell, more like the boundary of something, a visible edge without a clear inside or outside. Its face, to the extent that it had one, was arranged around 2 deep structural features that might have been eyes if eyes could be made of compressed light. It wore nothing. It carried nothing. But around it in the blue-lit air, there were shapes complex, spiraling shapes, 3-dimensional and rotating, that Mara recognized immediately. It was drawing equations in the air, slowly, as if it had been doing this for 3 centuries and had learned to be patient. Nobody moved. Mara moved. She walked forward. Behind her, she heard Commander Vrek start to say something and her father say, quietly and with the certainty of long experience, "Let her go." She stopped about 2 meters from the entity and looked at the equations in the air. They were layered, the Kethara structure at the center, and around it, extending outward in shells, dozens of other structures she didn't recognize. The Kethara equation was the simplest one. It was, she realized, the introduction. The first word of a very long sentence. She held up her tablet. On the screen, her collapse function, the one she had written 20 minutes ago in a briefing room. The entity's luminous structural eyes moved to the screen, then back to her face. A pause. It reached out slowly, and in the air between them drew one additional symbol. It was small, almost tentative. It was a modification of her collapse function, a refinement, a correction of a rounding error she hadn't known she'd made. Mara looked at the correction for a moment. "Oh," she said, "yeah, that's better." She updated the tablet, held it up again. The entity drew another symbol. This one led to 3 more, which opened into a cascade of structures spreading outward from the original equation like a tree branching in fast forward. and Mara tracked it with the focused quiet she usually reserved for particularly good books, writing as she went, adapting, following the cascade where it led. Behind her, she heard Sevra Khan move forward, then Kale Sorrow, then the other xenomathematician. Within 4 minutes, every scientist in the corridor was crowded around the two of them, the ancient dormant alien and the 17-year-old with a trainee badge, following the equations as they built outward, each one leading to the next, 5,000 years of accumulated mathematics unfolding in the pale blue air. What the Cathara equation actually was, as it turned out, was a key not to the vault but out of it. This took some time to establish, partly because the concept required frameworks that didn't exist in consortium mathematical language and had to be built on the fly from borrowed components, and partly because the entity, which the ancient founding architect records, when Emeka finally tracked them down, called Hekaru-Sal, communicated exclusively through mathematics, and not all mathematics translated cleanly into intention. But over the course of the next 6 hours, working on the floor of the vault access corridor with tablets spread around them and half the scientific staff of the station crowded in the doorway, the shape of it emerged. Hekaru-Sal was not a prisoner. Hekaru-Sal was a recorder. The founding architects, 4,000 years ago, had built the vault not as a prison but as a library, specifically, as a means of preserving and transmitting a body of knowledge so comprehensive that no individual species could hold it all, a compendium of solved problems accumulated across 11 million years of pre-consortium civilization. The Cathara lock had not been designed to keep Hekaru-Sal in. It had been designed to keep everyone else out until someone arrived who could read it. The mathematical framework required to solve the Cathara equation was, the founding architects had apparently decided, sufficient proof that the species which solved it was ready to receive what was inside. Every species that had tried to brute force the lock, every species that had hammered at it with raw computation or recursive algorithm generation, had failed, not because they weren't clever enough, but because they were trying to solve it the wrong way. The lock required not power but perspective, a shift in framing, the ability to look at a loop and say, maybe the question is wrong. This was, by a significant margin, a more human cognitive trait than a Vethani one. The consortium's oldest and most respected scientific tradition was, structurally speaking, a very sophisticated form of always looking for the beginning. Mara, who had spent her whole childhood being told that her sideways thinking was a liability, sat on the floor of the vault access corridor and ate a protein bar she had found in her jacket pocket and thought about that for a while. Sevra Khan sat down next to her, which surprised her. He was 140 years old and his joints made sounds when he bent them. "I want to understand something," he said. "Okay." "When you looked at the equation on the display in the briefing room," he paused, "how long did it take?" Mara considered this. For the core insight, maybe 4 seconds. To work out the collapse function, maybe another 6 or 7 minutes. Sevra Khan was quiet. "I don't think I'm smarter than your mathematicians," Mara said. "I think I grew up asking different questions. My dad does xenoarchaeology. We moved around a lot. I went to 7 schools on 4 different stations before I was 12. Every school taught things differently. Every teacher had a different framework. And when you see enough different frameworks, you start noticing the one thing none of them are saying. The gap between them. That's where the interesting stuff usually is." "You found the gap in 5,000 years of Vethani mathematics," Sevra Khan said. "The gap was the same size as all the others," Mara said. "I just happened to be looking." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, filtered through Vethani vocal anatomy, which did not produce human laughter naturally. It came out as a kind of resonant exhale. "Hekaru-Sal has been waiting," he said. 300 years of knocking." 300 years and nobody answered, Mara said. "What's that like?" Sevra Khan looked at Hekaru-Sal, who was standing in the blue light of the vault entrance, drawing slow equations in the air, waiting with the patience of something that had already waited 11 million years, and had learned that patience was simply what time felt like from the inside. "I think," Sevrikan said slowly, "that Hekaru Sal may have known who would answer, or at least what kind of mind would answer. The founding architects, when they built the lock, were looking forward. They knew they were building something for a successor. They knew the successor would have to think differently than they did. So they built a lock that would only open for a different kind of thinking," Mara said. "Yes. And the consortium found the station 4,000 years ago, and spent 4,000 years trying to open it with Vethani thinking." "Yes. And humans showed up." Mara glanced at her father, who was deep in a translation session with Hekaru Sal and 3 increasingly stunned xenolinguists. "What, maybe 80 years ago?" 73 years ago. 73 years ago, and nobody thought to hand the problem to us, until an administrative error put me in a briefing room. Sevrikan was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "nobody thought to." Mara nodded. She looked at her protein bar. "Well," she said, "next time there's something you've been failing at for several thousand years, maybe start there." The contents of the vault took 6 days to begin to catalog, and 6 years to begin to understand, and both of those timelines were considered extremely fast by anyone who understood the scale of what was inside. Hekaru Sal had not been dormant for 4,000 years in the way that a machine shuts down. He had been dormant the way a deep ocean creature holds still, preserving function while external conditions remained unsuitable for what came next. What he carried in his biology, in the mathematical structures encoded in his body's electromagnetic field, in the slow-light equations he drew in the air, was the accumulated problem-solving record of 11 civilizations spanning 11 million years. Not history, not culture, not art, specifically solutions. Every time a civilization he had witnessed had encountered a problem it couldn't solve, and then solved it, and then understood why it had been hard, that moment of turning was what he recorded. The shape of the change in thinking, the geometry of the cognitive shift. The founding architects had built him, or helped build him, or possibly found him, and simply given him a home for the library he already carried. The records were ambiguous on this point, and Emeka Okafor spent 3 of the 6 years arguing about it with a rotating consortium of historians. The point, Mara thought, was less interesting than the contents. Because the contents were, in the most literal sense, a record of how to get unstuck. Every species that had ever hit a wall, a scientific problem, a mathematical barrier, a technological ceiling, had eventually gotten past it. The way they got past it was rarely what they had been trying. It was almost always a shift, a willingness to ask a question that hadn't been on the list. The vault was 5,000 solved impossibilities, each one tagged with the exact moment of the conceptual shift that had cracked it. "It's a library of perspective changes," Mara told her father on the 3rd day. They were eating in the vault anteroom because neither of them had wanted to leave, and the station cafeteria was 2 corridors away, which felt too far. "Yes," her father said. "Whoever built it knew that the bottleneck isn't intelligence. It's framing. You can be as smart as you want, but if you're asking the wrong question, you'll never get anywhere." "Yes," her father said. "And they built the lock so that only something that had learned to ask different questions could open it." "Yes," her father said. He was smiling at her with the particular smile that meant he had known this for a while and had been waiting for her to reach it herself. She had grown up with that smile. It had always made her want to solve things faster. "Dad," she said. "Yes. The consortium is going to want to replicate this. To study the pattern, extract the frameworks, catalog the shift geometries. That's already being discussed. They're going to do it the Vethani way, systematically, comprehensively. They're going to build a whole new field of study and spend several hundred years on it. Probably. That'll work, Mara said. Eventually. Yes. But it'll take a while. It will, her father agreed. Whereas if they actually wanted to go fast, Mara said, they'd give the library to humans and let us wander around in it unsupervised for about a decade. Emeka Okafor laughed, a real laugh, the deep one that meant she had said something he genuinely hadn't expected. I'll put that in my report, he said. What followed was not quite as dramatic as Mara's suggestion, but it was closer than the consortium was entirely comfortable with. The humans, as a species, had been in the consortium for 73 years and had spent most of that time being politely underestimated. They were new. They were small. They had a tendency, in formal settings, to ask questions that made everyone else in the room uncomfortable, not because the questions were rude, but because they were aimed at gaps that everyone else had agreed, through long convention, to ignore. Mara's father filed his report. The report included, in its appendices, a formal proposal that a small team of human researchers, drawn from disciplines as far apart as possible, with the specific quality of having demonstrated what the proposal called structural lateral thinking in their prior work, be given primary access to the Vault's catalog for an initial 10-year period. The proposal cited, as its primary evidence for this approach, one solved equation and the 5,211 years of Vethani failure that had preceded it. The proposal was, after extensive debate, approved. The team was assembled over the following year. Mara was not on it initially. She was still a trainee, still technically in the administrative error situation vis-a-vis her clearance, and the team required full research credentials. She went back to her studies. She finished her xenomathematics module and started xenoarchaeology, and spent her evenings working through the first of the Vault's problems that Hekaru Sal had flagged as related to the Kethara structure, which was either a courtesy toward her or a coincidence, and she was fairly sure it wasn't a coincidence. She was 19 when she solved the second one. That one took her 3 weeks, which was slightly embarrassing given that she'd done the first in minutes. But the second problem was different. It wasn't a mathematical lock. It was an engineering contradiction embedded in a material science framework that 3 separate civilizations had tried to resolve over a combined 4,000 years, and the contradiction turned out to hinge on an assumption about how certain particles behaved under specific resonance conditions that all 3 civilizations had inherited from the first one without ever questioning it. The assumption was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, not dangerously wrong, just quietly, foundationally, wrong in a way that nobody had noticed because everyone had been taught it as a fact. Mara noticed it because her mother, who was a structural engineer, had once told her that the most dangerous thing in any building was a load-bearing assumption, something everyone was leaning on without knowing it was there. When Mara found the assumption in the materials problem, she recognized it immediately. She had been looking for it without knowing she was looking. She sent her solution to her father. He sent it to the research team. The team spent a week checking it. Then they updated her clearance and added her to the team. She had just turned 20. Hekaru Sal, in the 3rd year, began communicating in something other than mathematics. This was a large development. The xenolinguists had been working toward it since the beginning, building frameworks from the mathematical language he shared, trying to construct bridges from equations to what might be called grammar, the structure of how meaning moved, not just how it was encoded. They got close several times and then lost the thread, and Hekaru Sal waited patiently each time, drawing slow equations in the air, knocking in his gentle and ancient way. The breakthrough happened, not accidentally in a side conversation. Mara was working on the 4th Vault problem, a cosmological model that contained an unexplained variable no one had been able to define, and she had gotten stuck, which was a new feeling for her and not one she enjoyed. She was sitting on the floor of the vault anteroom, cross-legged, eating another protein bar. She had started keeping a supply in her locker, and she was staring at the variable on her tablet and thinking about what her mother would call a load-bearing assumption, and what her father would call the thing nobody was saying, and what she herself was starting to call the gap, and she was not finding it. Hekarusal came and sat down next to her. Not stood, sat. He lowered himself to the floor with the slow deliberateness of something that had not bent that way in a long time and was relearning the geometry of the position. Then he looked at her tablet. He drew something in the air, not an equation, not this time. A shape. Then the shape again, modified. Then a third version that was clearly a question. Mara looked at the shapes, looked at her variable, looked at the shapes again. "Are you asking me what it represents?" she said. A fourth shape, which had the feeling of a yes. "I don't know," Mara said. "That's the problem. It's there in the model, but I can't define it. Every time I try to define it, it changes." Hekarusal drew the fourth shape again, and then, slowly, beside it, he drew her variable. Then he drew them together, merged as one shape. Mara stared at this for a long moment. "You're saying the variable is the same thing as the question," she said. A fifth shape which felt like, almost. "You're saying the variable is the act of questioning." She paused. "The variable isn't undefined, it's definitionally a placeholder for what you don't know yet. It's not that we can't define it. It's that defining it would change what it means. It's supposed to stay open." Hekarusal was still. Then he drew something new, complex, layered, many-stranded, and set it next to her variable. And Mara recognized it immediately because it had the same emotional weight as the moment she had looked at the Cathara structure and thought, "What if you don't find the beginning?" It was the same insight, just bigger. The cosmological model wasn't describing a universe that had an unexplained variable. It was describing a universe built around one. A universe whose architecture required a fundamental open question at its center. Not because the question hadn't been answered yet, but because a universe with no open questions at its center would be a universe with no room to change. Mara sat on the floor of the vault anteroom for a long moment, holding this. "That's the biggest thing anyone has ever told me," she said. Hekarusal made a sound, not mathematical, not linguistic, just a sound warm and resonant like a very low note held a long time. It was the first non-mathematical thing he had ever communicated, and the xenolinguists who had been working for 3 years to reach this moment were, unfortunately, 2 corridors away getting lunch. Mara didn't tell them about it for a while. She wanted to keep it to herself a little longer, not selfishly, not for credit, just because some things were better held quietly before they became official. The research team spent 10 years on the vault's problems. In that time they resolved, partially or completely, 9 of the 57 problems Hekarusal had flagged as highest priority, a rate that was, according to every projection model the consortium had run before the humans arrived, supposed to have taken between 300 and 400 years. The consortium academic community's response to this was complicated. There was genuine awe, the kind that expressed itself mostly in formal papers. There was also discomfort, the kind that expressed itself mostly in committee meetings, where various senior researchers floated increasingly elaborate explanations for why the human results were anomalous or context-specific, or perhaps not fully reproducible under ideal conditions. Mara's father, when she described this to him, said, "They've been looking for the beginning again." The beginning of what? Of a reason why you can do this and they can't. They're looking for the thing that makes humans special, some genetic factor, some cognitive quirk, something they can isolate and study and eventually replicate. They want to solve humanity the way you solve the Cathara lock. Find the beginning of the loop. "But there isn't one," Mara said. "No," her father said, "there isn't." It's not a specific cognitive trait. It's not a special kind of brain. It's what you told Sevra Khan. 7 schools on 4 stations. Different frameworks, different questions, different gaps. It's not what humans are, it's what humans have been doing. Moving through difference. Spending our whole civilization in contexts we didn't grow up in, learning to find the gap between frameworks, learning to ask the question nobody was asking. He paused. The vault is a library of perspective shifts. The founding architects built it for the species that had the most practice making them. Mara thought about this. Did they know about us, she said, 11 million years ago? I don't think they knew about us specifically, her father said. I think they knew that eventually something like us would come along, something that had been shaped by enough dislocation and displacement and exposure to radically different ways of seeing that it had learned to see between the ways. He looked at her with the particular expression that was pride with exhaustion layered over it, the one she had been looking at her whole life. They built a lock for a mind like yours, Mara. They just had to wait for us to get there. Hekarusal left in the 12th year. Not abruptly, not without warning. He spent the final months of his time on the station, drawing an extended mathematical sequence that the research team spent 2 years afterward fully unpacking, and which turned out to be both a catalog key and a farewell. A structure that connected every problem in the vault to every other, showed the relationships between them, and indicated, with the quiet elegance of something very old and very practiced, which ones were meant to stay open. The ones meant to stay open were the ones that pointed outward, beyond the vault, beyond the station, beyond what any of the 11 civilizations had known or seen. On the day he left, Mara was in the vault anteroom when he came through. She had been working on a problem that had no name yet, one of the outward-pointing ones, and she had her tablet and her protein bar and her cross-legged posture on the floor, and he came through and stopped, and she looked up. He drew one shape in the air, just one. She had never seen this particular shape before, but she recognized it immediately in the same way she had recognized the load-bearing assumption in the materials problem, in the same way she had recognized the gap in the Cathara loop. It was an open variable, the same one at the center of the cosmological model, the one that was definitionally a placeholder for what you didn't know yet. He was saying, "This is for you." She held up her tablet and drew it back at him. He made the sound again, the warm, resonant low note, longer this time, and then he walked through the vault door, and the pale blue light went with him, and the door slid back into place with the same deliberate patience with which it had opened 12 years before. The corridor lights returned to amber, then to standard. Mara sat on the floor for a while longer and finished her protein bar and thought about the shape. Then she opened her tablet and started working on the problem it belonged to. She was 32 when she solved the first of the outward-pointing problems. She was the lead of the research team by then, and the team had expanded to 12 humans, and in a development that nobody had predicted but everyone agreed made sense in retrospect. A rotating group of consortium scientists who had spent between 5 and 15 years working alongside humans, and had, through sustained proximity, developed what the academic literature was gingerly starting to call cross-species lateral cognition transfer. In layperson's terms, they had learned, slowly and with difficulty and not perfectly, to look for the gap. The first outward-pointing solution was not a mathematical solution. It was a question. Specifically, it was the correct formulation of a question about the nature of a cosmological phenomenon that every species in the consortium, and all 11 of Hekarusal's recorded civilizations, had been asking incorrectly for as long as they had been observing it. The phenomenon had a name in every language. The question had been asked in every known mathematical framework. The answers had never converged because the question, as formulated in every existing framework, contained an embedded assumption that made the answer impossible. Mara had found the assumption in her 29th year. She had spent 3 years working out how to correctly re-ask the question without it. The answer to the correctly asked question took 6 minutes. She sent the result to her father. He was 71 now and had retired from field work but not from thinking, and his response arrived in 14 seconds, which was the fastest she had ever seen him respond to anything. The message said, "The founding architects would be pleased." She replied, "They'd probably say they expected us." He replied, "They probably did." She put the tablet down and looked out the viewport at the stars, which were the same stars they had always been, indifferent to whether you asked about them correctly. She thought about Hekaru Saul, somewhere out there in the dark, carrying his library of perspective shifts to whatever came next. She thought about the shape he had drawn for her. She thought about the variable at the center of the cosmological model, the one that was definitionally open, the one that was supposed to stay that way. She thought about her mother, who had said, "The most dangerous thing is a load-bearing assumption." She thought about her father, who had said, "The most interesting thing is what nobody's saying." She thought about Severick Khan, who was dead now 40 years and 1 week ago, but who had, before he died, given a lecture that had become the most cited paper in consortium xenomathematics, "The Kathara Solution and the Epistemology of the Unanswered Question," by Severick Khan of the Vithani Institute, with addendum by M. Akaffer, trainee, administrative error, station clearance, unverified at time of contribution. He had kept the parenthetical. She had asked him once why. "Because it is accurate," he had said, "and because accuracy is more interesting than dignity in the long run." She had liked him very much in the end. She picked up the tablet, started on the next outward-pointing problem. Outside, the stars were the same as they always were. Inside the tablet, the gap waited, patient and open, the way it always did. She looked for it. She found it.